Good evening, friends. Wow, I think we can do a little better than that, right? Good evening, friends. All right, wonderful. Let's pretend for the people that are watching the video that there's tons of you in the audience, right? So give that impression. Thank you so much for coming. We're really happy to have this start of a new lecture series on the book, The Good News. And today we're going to go through the journey together on discovering the book and all the reasons why it's such a profound experience in Spiritism. And for the benefit of those that are going to be watching us on YouTube later who may not know anything about Spiritism, we're going to do a little bit of an introduction in today's presentation to set up the framework and contextualize a little bit why this book is so important in Spiritism, as well as for the spiritual awakening of anyone who comes with an open mind and open heart and is receptive to the message. So in order for us to do that, we're going to, before delving in the text itself, we're going to see who is this Humberto de Campos, the author of the book, the spirit author, both in his physical personality and his discarnate personality. We're going to read the introduction of the Good News and pick a little of the historical references to see why the author makes that introduction. And then we'll go into chapter 1, followed by some reflections and Q&A at the end. So this book has 30 chapters. And Humberto de Campos, the author, picked 30 moments in the gospel, in the passage of Jesus on the earth, that were recorded in the 4 gospels. But he expands. It's almost like we go to Google Maps and we zoom out a little bit and we get to see much more of the territory, so we understand what was happening that day with the apostles, with the people in the town, that led Jesus to give the teaching that was recorded in the texts, and what was the follow-up to it. So we're able to zoom out, and while we zoom out, we're also able to really zoom in, because we gain a much 360-degree understanding of some of the most unforgettable teachings of Jesus. So let's start with who was Humberto de Campos. For those of us that are Brazilian in the audience, he was a very important figure in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. He was a journalist, a politician, and a writer, and he was entered into the very prestigious Brazilian Academy of Letters. And he suffered throughout his life from very poor conditions, always in financial struggles. He was born in a very small town in the northeastern state of Maranhão. And very quickly, at an early age, he gained national prominence for all the chronicles, all the articles that he wrote. He was constantly striving to make ends meet, and this is probably the reason why he never had time to dedicate himself to write long books. The biggest publication of his is called Conselheiro 20, which he makes a reference to in the introduction. But he was always writing short chronicles, short articles in all the major newspapers of Brazil. So that's the personality of Humberto de Campos alive. Now, he died at the age of 46? Yeah. No, 42. It's right there. Thank you, Marcela. I just have to read my notes. It's not that hard. And 2 years before he passed away, he came into contact with Chico Xavier's very first book, Parnassus from Beyond the Grave, or Parnassus de Além Túmulo. So we've talked about the human personality of Humberto de Campos, a very important journalist in Brazil in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And we have some declarations that he made prior to his passing away in the last 2 years of his life, when he was struggling a lot. When he came across the books and he made some declarations saying, wow, watch out, authors, now you have competition from the spirit life. And he recognized the validity of it. And we can tell from his writings that he was a very devoted man religiously, but he wasn't attached to any organized religion when he was alive. What's amazing about the connection between Chico Xavier and Humberto And for those of us that are watching that may not be familiar about who Chico Xavier is, he's considered one of the most important mediums on the planet, and definitely the most important medium in Brazil in the 20th century. Not only the body of work that he was able to receive from the spirit realm and transmit is vast, but he was also a tremendous humanitarian. All of the rights of the books that he channeled, he gave away to charity and donated, so he never kept 1 cent of any of the earnings. And these books have been translated to many languages, have sold millions of copies, and helped to shape Spiritism in Brazil. So when Chico was just in the beginning of his channeling mission as a medium, he goes in a dream to a place where it was very beautiful, a park with beautiful trees. But he noticed that under this tree, made of crystal colors, beautiful crystal colors, he saw Humberto de Campos there. And Humberto de Campos comes to Chico in that dream and says, aren't you the boy from the Parnassus de Além Túmulo? Of course, that meeting was orchestrated by Chico's spirit guide, Emmanuel, who would bring all of these spirits to Chico and organize his mission of channeling or psychographing all of the books. Now, it's amazing that 15 books were written through the hands of Chico by Humberto de Campos. This is extraordinary because when we look at the contribution of literary works that Humberto de Campos signed through the hands of Chico, we compare, for example, with the body of work by André Luiz, most of which has already been translated to English. Those were only 13 books. Of course, André Luiz gives several communications through Chico in individual letters and individual writings, but there are 13 books. So when we look, in the early 1930s, mid-1930s, Chico is just a young man, just starting out in his mediumship. And we look at how productive that mediumship is, because in 1936 is the very first book that Humberto de Campos gives to Chico, just 4 years after he begins his mediumship. The most famous of all the books that he channeled through Chico are these two: Good News, which we're studying today, and Brazil, Coração do Mundo, Pátria do Evangelho, which translates to Brazil, Heart of the World, Land of the Gospel. A book that has been read, has been studied by many people to help them understand why is it that Spiritism started in France, in Europe, and yet it blossomed so incredibly in Brazil. And today is the most Spiritist nation on the earth, whereas where it started in France is barely known, right? So this book gives a huge, beautiful understanding of that and the reasons behind it. Now we see here that during the year that Chico was receiving the Good News, it was right before he began into the journey of receiving Paul and Stephen, which is over here somewhere? No. Which in Chico's words, it's back there. In Chico's words, it was his favorite book that he received through Emmanuel, because his mediumship ability allowed him to not just receive the thoughts and transmit the letters and the messages, but he would actually go, like in a movie, and experience the scenes, see the people, relive everything. So much so that at the end of every book, he would feel a nostalgia, a sadness, because he became a family with all the characters. He was reliving the story with them. It's under that beautiful climate that he receives the Good News. Now, as you can see here, the Spirit André Luiz appears for the first time only after. So we see that the length of contribution and the engagement between Humberto de Campos and Chico lasts for several decades. And it's only fitting that the style of writing of Humberto de Campos is journalistic writings, short articles, almost like news reports from the afterlife. It's what makes his books so accessible and at the same time so beautiful. They're not like novels, beautiful, epic novels like Emmanuel. They are more short, precise accounts, but still retaining all that beauty from a very, very experienced writer, which he was during his lifetime. By the way, guys, if you have any questions, if you want to make comments, feel free to interrupt. Let's make this a very interactive conversation.
They met in the dream.
They met in the spirit world, yeah. Never while alive, no, that's right. And 3 months, only 3 months after Humberto de Campos discarnates, he already meets Chico, which, as we know in Spiritism, is a very, very short time after somebody arrives in the spirit world, which means that this spirit arrived there very much prepared, ready, willing, and able to continue to work. So it's very noble. So these are all the books, unfortunately, none of which have yet been translated to English. They're working on it, we know. And we're very, very pleased that our dear friends from Kardec Radio, who may be watching, Vanessa Anceloni and John and Carol and Mark and so many friends there, undertook the effort to translate the good news. And for those of you that are watching online, if you have the chance to go to kardecradio.com, you can access all the podcasts that Vanessa Anceloni did on each and every chapter. She took each chapter the same way we're going to do here, once a month, and she dissects it in the period of an hour to really connect with the feelings of the text. So I recommend for those of you that would like to get deeper into this book to go to kardecradio.com, and we're really thankful that she sent us the texts in English to help us, the speakers, to work from it. Any questions, comments? Okay, shall we move on? Okay, so today we're going to look at 2 texts, the introduction of the book and the first chapter. Now it's funny that the first chapter doesn't really give a lot of evangelical messages. It's not a specific part of the gospel story that Humberto de Campos extracts for deeper knowledge. It's still an introduction. So there's not much of an evangelical content, unfortunately, here for us to meditate on. There's more of a historical contextualization. So it's going to be a little more academic and a little less on the feeling side, but help me feel the feeling as we go through it, yeah? So bear in mind, this is a very, very famous journalist in Brazil that shortly after dying starts to channel materials where the content is completely different from what his readers were used to reading, right? So I'm going to read here because it's too much text here. Indulge me in listening attentively, and if it's too fast, please raise your hand, okay? So he says, in the school of the gospel, offering this modest effort to you, dear reader, listener, I think it's prudent to provide you with an explanation regarding the origin of these pages. Within them, I am the first to admit that my topics are not the same as the ones that he was writing when he was alive. He was writing about politics. Perhaps those who care about the exceptional expression of the form will not find the same style. Nowhere have I made mythological remarks. And in those old friends who, like myself there in the world, cannot fathom the realities of survival, I surprise you in advance regarding the strangest considerations. So he's setting up the scene for the reader who's going to be astonished. Some will certainly ask if I were promoted to evangelical minister. Such astonishment may be natural, but it is not very fair. The literary taste has always reflected the conditions of life of the spirit. The literary taste, here already is a first teaching here. The literary taste has always reflected the conditions of life of the spirit. So our taste for literary works and affinities compatible with our inner life. We do not need many examples to justify the assertion. My own literary activity on earth is divided into two essentially different phases. Now he makes a reference to his most popular work when he was alive. The pages of Conselheiro 20 or Counselor 20 are very different from those in which I open up the new emotions that pain, like a marvelous lamp, made me discover in the country of my soul. Beautiful way of reflecting on his experience of pain, and he's referring to the end of his life when he went through a lot of health struggles. My current concern is not to write to please, but to write profitably, meaning to take advantage profitably. I know how simple this effort is. However, I hope it reflects my testimony of admiration for those who work for the gospel in Brazil. I think it's very beautiful because he doesn't say spiritism, he doesn't say any particular philosophy or religion. Work for the gospel. And we're going to understand what the word gospel means, which is the name of the book. In the spheres closest to earth, our works to perfect feelings, emulating Christ, are also detailed and intense. I think this is a sentence worth repeating. In the spheres closest to the earth, our works, he's referring to himself, to perfect feelings, emulating Christ, are also detailed and intense. So he gives us an idea of where he is. Numerous schools multiplied for the discarnate spirits. And I, who now am a humble disciple of such schools of Jesus, recognize that the spiritual planes also have their folklore. Very beautiful when he says here, I who now am a humble disciple of such schools of Jesus. He's currently enrolled, as he writes this, in a school for the understanding of the gospel, one of the schools of Jesus, in one of the spheres closest to the earth. So I recognize that the spiritual planes also have their folklore, just like we have our news, our gossips, our popular things, our publications that are less popular, more popular. That's the folklore. Folklore, the meaning of the word, is oral traditions that are passed down from generation to generation and that make up a part of the identity of a community. That's what the word folklore is. So he gives some examples. The heroic and blessed deeds, often anonymous in the world, accomplished by anonymous individuals, contain profound lessons here, in which we find new strength. So all of the examples of mothers, fathers, workers, employees everywhere, who are devotedly working, overcoming themselves, and being able to really impart some of the teachings of Jesus in their own private lives, it's almost like they can see those examples, they can witness them, almost they can press play and draw strength and inspiration from those examples. It says, in which we find new strength. This is a living example for them to witness and to reflect on. All evangelical expressions have amongst us their living history. None of them is a superficial symbol. Innumerable observations about the Master and his followers pulsate in studious and sincere hearts. Quite beautiful. So those examples are alive there, almost like we were in an IMAX theater, experience it in 360 degrees. Of the thousands of episodes of heavenly folklore, thousands of episodes, and those 15 books that we had on the list contain a lot of those episodes, including many interviews that he has with people like Judas Iscariot and other personalities, Joan of Arc, which you'll see it's the same individual. Of the thousands of episodes of heavenly folklore, I gathered 30 and offer them for your consideration, generous friend, in this book. Is it too long? Okay, I'll speak up. Thank you, Mother. I gather 30 and offer them for your consideration, generous friend, who offers me your attention. I agree that it is few, but this should count as a useful attempt, since I am sure the indispensable help I received did not fail me. What is he saying here? He's not doing this work by himself. He's collaborating with a group of good-willed spirits in this effort. Today, and that's one of my favorite parts of the introduction, one of my favorite sentences. Today, I do not think that I believe, because I actually know. For me personally, this is one of the greatest achievements of studying Spiritism after so many years. We go from belief into the realm of understanding. I no longer have beliefs. I now understand things. I now see how they make sense. And by that shift, my faith is much stronger, or at least should be much stronger. We are always tested in the trials, right? So, he says, but I actually know. And the Master of Nazareth also aligns my hopes. Imagine a man so immersed in the materialism of his time to have the courage, just a few years later, to transmit teachings that had such a religious nature, to talk about Jesus so openly. It takes courage. It takes detachment. And it's quite beautiful that a person of that magnitude in the Brazilian life, literary life, is giving this information. So fresh, news so fresh from the other side. So today I do not think that I believe, because I actually know. And the Master of Nazareth also aligns my hopes. I remember that one day, lecturing with some Protestant friends in the spirit world, I noticed that they classified Jesus as the rock of ages, the rock of the centuries, the rock of ages. I smiled and moved on, like the pretentious, strong spirits of the world do. Today, however, I can no longer smile or pass by. I feel the millennial, luminous, and sublime rock that sustains our heart, mired in the swamp of secular miseries. And when I did some research online about the rock of ages, rock of centuries, truly is a reference that the Protestants make about Jesus, because they find those references in the Old Testament, in many of the Psalms of David, as well as in the letters of Paul to the Corinthians. We've drank the supernatural drink, and we've nourished from the supernatural bread from the rock, and the rock was Christ. And this rock was present before Moses, before all the fathers. And so it's quite a beautiful reference. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel that the teachings of Christ are a rock that anchors me, especially in the 21st century, in our very busy life, with so much input and distractions. If I can anchor myself in the rock of those teachings, all I need to do is flip a page of The Living Spring, Jesus in the Home, Happy Life, and just meditate for 5 minutes, and I get transported into that land of the gospel. Suddenly, I can breathe a sigh of relief. The word gospel means evangelium in Greek, which means good news. And it's funny that Chico, the medium, every time somebody would come to him, hadn't seen him in a while, everyone knows this story, they would come to, oh, Chico, hey, what's new? And Chico would always respond, the gospel, my son, that's new. Because it's good and it's still new. It's still relevant and it's still so urgent for us to understand and to have a relationship. So we always say, it's the gospel, my son, that's what's new. So here he goes and says, today, however, I can no longer smile. I feel the millennial, luminous, and sublime rock that sustains our hearts mired in the swamp of secular miseries. And here I am to give him, Jesus, my homage or my tribute of appreciation with these simple pages, cooperating with the ones who devotedly work in his divine cause of light and redemption. Jesus sees that a drop of his devoted and compassionate love penetrated the unclean vessel of my spirit. So much humility here, right? So much simplicity. From an immortal man from the Academy of Brazilian Letters. It's quite extraordinary. The wicked man, he's referring to himself, who arrived from the earth, found the ray of light destined for the purification of his sanctuary. He supports my thoughts with unlimited goodness. The earthly ridge still stifles the gold in my heart. The word ridge here in Portuguese is ganga. And the translation to English is unclear. But in the world of minerals, it represents a layer of unclean matter that compromises the purity of the mineral, compromises the cleanliness and the value of the mineral. It's called a ganga. In English, it's translated as ridge. I'm not a mineral expert, but it's sort of like the detritus, the dirt that compromises the mineral's purity. So he says the earthly ridge, meaning from all the material world and all its identifications, that ridge still stifles the gold in my heart that he gave me out of his mercy. But as Bartholomew, one of the disciples of Jesus, one of the apostles, I already take heart to meet the enemies of my peace, which are sheltering inside me. How beautiful. But as Bartholomew, like the courage of Bartholomew, I already take heart to meet the enemies of my peace, which are sheltering inside me. I have the joy of the gospel. The joy of the gospel. Let's meditate. If one of the takeaways that we can leave here in our hearts and our minds is this notion of the joy of the gospel. What is to feel the joy of the gospel? How do I act in the world with this joy of the gospel? How do I interact with others feeling the joy of the gospel? I have the joy of the gospel because I recognize that his love will not forsake me, will not abandon me. My spirit works and rests while relying upon such friendly and generous protection. So it's this notion of being one with, communing with, fusing with the Christ-like energy as he's writing this to us. Now it's almost over, promise. Now, to strengthen the astonishment, he's referring to those that are reading him in the earth. Now, to strengthen the astonishment of those who read me critically, as per the nature of our time, I justify the real substance of the narrative in this book by quoting the Apostle Mark. When Mark says, in chapter 4:34, quote, he did not say anything to them, the crowd, without using a parable. But when he was alone with his own disciples, he explained everything. Then Humberto de Campos says, and the Apostle John. So he quotes Mark and John. When John states in chapter 21:25, quote, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. And it was just 3 years of his gospel ministry with us. And we have 4 gospels that came down to us as the official accounts of the life of Jesus that we study along with the Acts, along with the letters of Paul. This gives us a glimpse of how much more information is out there in the spirit realm, which is readily accessible to spirit authors, which they can transmit from the thousands of heavenly folklore that he describes here that are most useful, most beneficial for us to deepen our journey into the life of Jesus, right? So this book is a journey, and it's such a beautiful journey. For those of you that have the ability to speak Portuguese amongst us, you can go online. This book is available as a PDF. Before you go to sleep, instead of going on your social media, which we're all guilty of doing, get a chapter. The chapter is 3 pages. It's not enough for you to fall asleep. You can finish it and then fall asleep. But to be able to start tasting the beauty of the way he writes, so that when we come here and go through this journey for the next 29 months, we can feel Humberto de Campos' spirit presence and the content that he is going to distill for us. And he concludes the introduction by saying, and that is it. As it turns out, I have no references to the classics of ancient or contemporary literature. I quote Mark and John. It is clear that they are informed spirits and evangelized spirits. Look at the use of the word evangelized. We don't often hear the use of the word as a verb. If I were to rank my soul at this current day, September 13th, 16th, 2018, for those on the video, from 0 to 100%, what percentage is my soul today evangelized? Ask ourselves. Don't need to answer. 0 to 100% evangelized. What happens when our soul gets to 100% evangelized? Feel free. Become disciples. Disciples is followers of Christ, right?
We're attuned to the will of God.
We are attuned to the will of God. Nice, Adjuson. We are attuned fully to the will of God. Yeah? So, we are following Jesus' teachings. We are following the messages. And we are not 100% faithful to it because of our natural condition as spirits that are in a planet of trials and expiations. But are we at 0% evangelized? I want to believe that we're not. Definitely not 100. We're somewhere in the middle, and that middle is to each and every one of our own conscience to dictate. But to be evangelized, I believe, is to how close do I feel the teachings of Jesus as I study it? And how much do they come out from me spontaneously, freely, without me having to think or act, without having to make an effort, right? How much do they flow out from me spontaneously and affect people in my words, in my thoughts, and in my actions? When they are spontaneously, freely expressed in those 3 ways, I believe that's the quota of evangelization that we've reached. And we have many incarnations to internalize those teachings and evangelize our soul. But the good news, one of many, is that we don't have to do it alone. And the strength of a community that gathers around these teachings with the intention is so powerful that we're going to see in the next chapter how much of a spiritual protection, how much of a magnetic strength these teachings have the power to do, not only in individual hearts, but in communities and in the whole planet. So, I quote, just to conclude, he says, I didn't quote any famous authors from antiquity or from the contemporary world. He said, I quote Mark and John. It is clear that they are informed spirits and evangelized spirits. And I now ask God to bless my hope of belonging to the latter number, meaning evangelized, not just informed, not just intellectually informed, but evangelized. November 9th, 1940. Any thoughts Any impressions, any questions on the introduction to the good news? John the Evangelist. Yes, he quoted John the Evangelist, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Everybody's cold? A lot of air conditioning going? All right. Shall we continue? Okay. So, like I said, chapter 1 is not a specific passage of the gospel that Humberto de Campos expands on, but is more a description of the time in history that Jesus' teachings came to the earth. And he begins to describe what was happening in the world at that time. That's why I said, I give you a warning so that you can fall asleep more comfortably, that this lecture is going to be a lot of historical references. And starting from chapter 2, does Humberto de Campos really take us in the journey of the gospel messages themselves. So he starts the chapter by talking about the Roman Empire. And he says that the historians of the Roman Empire have always noted with astonishment the profound contrasts of the glorious time of Augustus, Octavius Augustus, who was the great nephew of Julius Caesar, who was killed previously. So he reigned for 41 years. It's the longest time that any Roman authority ruled during the period of the empire, 41 years. Now we'll begin to get a glimpse of what was going on in the empire at the time, because he says profound contrasts. Historians are astonished. So the full name of the gentleman is Caius Julius Caesar Octavian, came to power, notwithstanding his remarkable ascendancy, through a series of fortunate events, like coincidental events. The elite of the old republic, meaning the old-timers, the people that were very traditional in their thinking, could not believe in his triumph. All the triumphs and the fortunate events that led him to become the emperor. And then he goes into a little bit of history here, so let's be patient, I'll read for us. Having allied himself against the takeover by Antonius with the traitors who murdered his adoptive father, his intentions were always confronted by bleak prospects. Indeed, his first victories began with the establishment of the triumvirate. The triumvirate in Rome's time was basically a group of 3 rulers that shared the sovereignty of the Roman Empire, followed by the failures of Antonio in the east, which opened doors for Augustus in unexpected ways. Okay, we're done with lesson of history for now. Now he goes into the moment, the spiritual moment of the time. As though the world at that moment were sensing a blessed renewal of values, all the legions of soldiers, rapidly surrendered without resistance to the son of the sovereign who had been murdered. Interesting, right? We begin to understand how the spirit realm and God and all the messengers of God, including Christ, have such an influence in the outcome of world events, and how our free will is free, but yet it's so relative within a sphere of our action, right? We tend to think I have unlimited free will and I'm free. Yeah, it's relative free will, because the spirit realm and the guides of this planet are the ones in control always. A new era began with that energetic and generous young man. So he's describing the moral characteristics of Augustus, and I think that's very interesting for us to also meditate on. As though influenced by a group of unknown forces, the greatest empire of the world now rested on a wave of harmony and joy after centuries of terrible wars. That's why they call this period Pax Romana, Roman peace. Temples and monuments were raised everywhere. The hymn of a lasting peace started in Rome, and it reached the most remote of its provinces. And this is a photo of the Roman Empire shortly after the time of Augustus. Pretty big sphere of influence, right? So the long-suffering masses greeted these changes with happiness. The city of the Caesars came to be populated just not only by migrations of people, but also reincarnations. The city of the Caesars came to be populated by artists and noble, productive spirits. A blessed sense of security was present everywhere. A blessed sense of security. How many hours in the day of our day here do we walk around feeling a blessed sense of security? Right? We can feel that blessed sense of security when we are aligned, as Adjusson said, with the will of God and in connection with the gospel messages. It's just that our eyes can't really perceive what's happening in the invisible sphere, and we are so bombarded by our fears that we carry within ourselves that when we're walking around, most of the time we are in fight or flight mode, aren't we? We are in action and reaction and constant struggle. When can we feel a blessed sense of security? Everywhere. That's an inner state that he's describing. He's not describing a building. He's not describing a location. He's describing a spiritual atmosphere. A blessed sense of security was present everywhere. The laws were revised, providing the benefits of education and justice to the people. Now he goes into the Augustus himself, the individual Augustus, the spirit Augustus, right here. However, the unforgettable emperor was feeble and sick. Feeble is weak, fragile. The chroniclers of the time, all the historians and the what do you call those? Not journalists, but there's a older term, scribes. Thank you. The scribes of the time referred repeatedly to the rashes that covered his skin, which from time to time hurt like painful darts. Octavius, the emperor, they referred to him as Octavius. It's funny because he died in the month that later came to be known as August because of him. He died in August, and so after that, let's name the month of his death the month of August, which happens to be the number 8 for Octavius. I think it's pretty cool. Our month of August for Octavius. He passes away, and he even became an adjective. For all the emperors afterwards, they would say, "Dear August," "Dear Augustus." And today this word is used in the English language to convey a spirit of magnanimity, of generosity. He's just an august person, an august presence. It's a sense of generosity, magnanimity. It takes a lot for one individual's life example to become an adjective for 2,000 plus years. So we have an understanding that the spirit realm prepared this spirit to be at that place at that time for a reason. Let's read more about his spiritual state. He was never healthy. His legs were always wrapped, and his chest was always protected against the wind, which could cause incessant colds. Often he complained about migraines, which were followed by a feeling of weakness. I don't know about you, but this is not stated here, and I've done my research in the Spiritist literature, and as far as I could research, I couldn't find other references in the Spiritist literature about Augustus, the Spirit. But this describes a spirit who is going through an expiation. This describes a spirit who is expelling a lot of impurities in his spirit body that he may have incurred in previous lives, perhaps in a position of leadership also, because he was such a disciplined and visionary leader that he annexed all these areas here as become part of the empire. And one of the most beautiful obelisks in the world were extracted from ancient Egypt and brought to one of the main arenas of Rome. And they still to this day bear the inscription that Augustus did that. Maybe he was there as a pharaoh. We don't know. But it clearly shows that this is a spirit that had some level of preparation in the trials of leadership, in the trials of power. And now he is also, as he's acting as a leader, also expiating and expelling all of these negative energies into his physical body. So, this is the state of Augustus. Feeble, sick, never healthy, with rashes, with sores. And look at the responsibility that was in his shoulders. The leader of the greatest empire in the world. Not only in this manner had the emperor suffered from the extreme twists and turns of human life. So Humberto is saying not just physically he was suffering. He who had revived customs and had restored the purest family traditions. Emmanuel will talk about this in other books of Spiritism. He was able to restore the purest family values, most spiritualized values. He was able to restore that during his reign. Which leader is able? Can we think of many leaders who are able to restore the family values in their purest sense during their reign? It takes an incredibly moral, evangelized leader to be able to impart that into the society, right? He who had revived those customs and restored the purest family traditions, who had been the most successful in reorganizing the empire, was forced to humiliate his deepest and most delicate feelings as a father and sovereign by decreeing the banishment of his only daughter, exiling her to the island of Pandataria, I don't know how to pronounce that, due to her reprehensible life of scandals in court. So her conduct was reprehensible in court. He did not tolerate it. He didn't welcome that, and he was forced to banish her publicly to be in exile in this island, his only daughter. Now it takes a lot for a father to do that, right? It shows the level of idealism that harbored his heart. Later, he was also forced to take similar action against his granddaughter. He noticed that his beloved companion, his wife, was becoming involved in private family matters, such as successive poisonings of his most direct descendants, causing feelings of distressful anxiety in his heart. This man was utter lonely, alone by himself in the struggle. Daughter, granddaughter, companion, wife, all this intrigue, all this deceitful environment around him, causing him a lot of anxiety. Not only the physical side, but also the spiritual part of the family. And this is a man that restored the purest family traditions, and yet in the midst of his own family, so much struggle, right? Now, can we imagine what that must be like? Nonetheless, his name was given to the illustrious century that saw his birth. The long years of his government were marked by unforgettable initiatives. The collective soul of the empire never felt such a sense of stability and joy. Now, Humberto is leading us into the next big idea in the chapter here, but he's preparing us with this unseen force from the spirit world, this blessed joy, blessed security. And he says this again, the collective soul of the empire never felt such a sense of stability and joy. The glorious vista of Rome had never assembled so many wise men. It was during this time that Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Sallust, Livy, and Maecenas arose as favorites of the gods. These are very important writers, authors, artists that made the time of Rome very beautiful with their sculptures, with their contributions. How are we doing? Do we need to stand up and stretch? Do we need to take a break? I know it's a lot of reading, but I prefer that we read here than we put so much text up there, right? At least it's not as easy for you to fall asleep, hopefully. How are we doing? Good? Okay. Now Humberto continues to describe the scene, this kind of scene. Everywhere superb marbles were being carved. Sumptuous gardens were being created. Palaces and sanctuaries were being built. Intelligence was being protected. It's a very powerful statement. Intelligence was being protected, meaning exalted, meaning encouraged by the laws, bless you, by the values that he was imparting as a leader. Intelligence was being protected. Laws of harmony and justice were created in an ocean of unsurpassed peace. How many times he says the word peace, serenity, security? The chariots of triumph of the legions of the soldiers, for a while had forgotten the bloody palms, and the goddess Victory, that goddess of victory, that symbol, would no longer smile on acts of destruction and slaughter. People are looking at my piece of paper going, oh my God, there's so much more to go. Okay. Keep going. Thank you, Sonia. So this is not from the good news, but two sections from Emmanuel's book. The first one is describing this part of the time. It was time for Christ's missions. The consoling nearness and presence of the Divine Master in the world was a reason for all hearts to experience new life, even though they were unaware of the divine source of those comforting vibrations. As a consequence, Augustus's government resulted in a time of great tranquility for Rome. So you see, it's not just the merit of Augustus. This is a whole spiritual orchestration that's approaching the earth. And the rest of the planet's organized society, so it affected the entire planet. And in 2,000 years ago, he has two interesting quotes. First one regarding the persecution against the first Christians, which in the book 2,000 years ago, we notice how much they were persecuted in the very beginning of Christian history. He says, the empire founded by Augustus, which after the Republic's democratic gains, signified the greatest example of a powerful state in all epochs, did not tolerate any partisan gatherings as far as social and political doctrines were concerned. To make a contemporary example, we see such policies in a similar way in China, that the government prohibits the gathering of any social or political doctrines because it can be a threat to the homogeneity of the central government. So this is kind of like that same idea. At the time of Augustus, none of that was allowed, which is the reason why they were so persecuted from the very beginning. And they had to gather in the catacombs at night or in people's homes undercover. Now, this is Emmanuel stepping out of the narrative and teaching something for us to reflect on for today. The same thing was happening in Rome as is happening in today's modern nations, which oscillate between the most varied forms of government along the axis of extremism and the ignorance of the people who persist in not understanding that the reforms of institutions must start with the individual. Up to today. And I think this is a very relevant thing for us to understand and to make an effort to do. The individual coming together and contributing to a community, and only that way with the individual's evangelization of his heart. That doesn't mean become an evangelical person. That doesn't mean become a spiritist. It just means internalizing the teachings of Jesus in my heart so that it's soaking in this evangelized content. Then, with enough people doing that, we can begin to reform the organizations. So, there's some ideas for us to meditate that complement the... Oops, sorry. Oh, I am fast forwarding. A glimpse of the upcoming attractions. Okay. Now he's going to talk about Augustus. He says, while presiding over large popular festivals, which in Rome was a very big pastime, the emperor, with his heart taken by anguish caused by the troubles of his personal life, often felt surprised when witnessing the joy and general tranquility of his people. So imagine him observing the whole crowd, and he's going through all this turmoil inside of him, but he's noticing that the people are joyful and tranquil. Why? Not able to explain the mystery of that endless wave of harmony. Look how beautiful. Not able to explain the mystery of that endless wave of harmony, he cried from emotion when, from the top of his golden podium, he listened to Horace. Horace is a famous Roman author and poet. Horace's famous composition, in which verses of undying beauty were emphasized. And this is the poem that was read in this particular moment that he registered. Anyone would like to read with the intonation of a poet? Use your creative abilities. Danny? Okay.
All fruitful, fertile sun, with your shiny carriage, you begin and end the day. You always rise anew and always the same. May you never see something greater than Rome.
Thank you. Very nice. We have a poet in the house. Now, as he was listening to this poem in the podium, in the middle of the festival, he began to cry, this kind of spiritual cry, that cathartic cry, this very deeply felt. And Humberto gives us an insight about the spiritual atmosphere of that moment. That is because the historians of Augustus' time did not realize that it was the century of the gospel and the good news. That was the reason why. It was the century of the gospel and the good news. Because imagine how many centuries has it taken for the creation of this planet to get to where it got to 2018 years ago, so that the governor of the planet, the one spirit that was entrusted by God with the creation and the spiritual supervision in every way of this one planet, how long did it take? Billions of years, all culminating in this very important moment where, according to Emmanuel, in more than one publication that he wrote through Chico, Earth had reached its spiritual adulthood or spiritual maturity. This was the moment, On the Way to the Light, he talks about that, and I believe 2,000 years ago, the moment of Earth's adulthood was reached. And I joke sometimes that we talk about here in the center, sometimes we say, we're all children, we're all children. That's not necessarily true. According to the spirits, we already late adolescents, early adults in many ways, because we've inherited, as incarnate beings living on planet Earth today, we've inherited a tremendous baggage of our past civilizations, of knowledge, wisdom, of advancements, that we are enjoying the fruits today. This makes us a little more than just children, because the world of spirits and providence would not invest so many resources in kindergarten children, because they wouldn't be able to handle it, right? So this is for us to gain a better sense of where we are. We're not in the kindergarten stage. We are advancing, and it's a good thing. And we need to cherish that, and we need to be grateful and embrace that. I believe. That's my opinion, I think. So this was the century of the gospel, and the good news is the reason why the entire spiritual atmosphere was saturated with all of that peace, with all that serenity, with all that joy, the joy of the gospel. Right? He continues. They, the historians of the time, they had forgotten that the noble Octavius was also a man, and that during his reign, they were not able to know that the realm of Christ was approaching the earth in deep vibrations of love and beauty. So the realm of Christ presupposes millions of spirits, so enlightened, so good, so sublime, ready to approach the earth and transmit these teachings. So it wasn't just Christ himself, right? He came accompanied by a very good crowd. Warlike spirits, such as those of Alexander the Great or Hannibal, were not approaching Rome and the world, which they did a few hundreds of years before. And this is an aside I'd like to make about the historical aspect of it. It's thanks to the spirit of Alexander the Great and his military expertise and ruthlessness that he, during the time of ancient Greece, a few hundred years before this time, he was able to expand the Greek Empire to most of the regions here. It is thanks to that the apostles, that the disciples were able to freely travel all over the known world and communicate with one another in Greek. The Gospels were written in Aramaic, which is a combination of Greek and Hebrew, like a dialect. But imagine if there wasn't one unifying language that stretched through the entire known world, how would have been the dissemination of the Gospel? It would have been so much harder. So we owe to these spirits that sometimes we see with the eyes of the flesh in this limited understanding, oh, what a ruthless tyrant. But perhaps each one had also their contribution to unify the world with one language. So, but those warlike spirits were not incarnating at this time. They were not around. Instead, they were not approaching Rome and the world. But other spirits, dressed in fishermen's rags, would serve as the indestructible base of the eternal teachings of the Lord. Isn't that incredible? When we think of it from a material understanding of society and the importance that we place in social institutions and social positions, the dissemination of the good news was given in the hands of beings that would reincarnate in the most remote, insignificant place at the time, middle of Galilee, dressed in rags, simple men and women, without power, without wealth, without position. He would entrust it to them. There's a huge lesson there, right, for us to think about. Spirits who, he's still talking about those spirits, the dressed in fisherman's rag. Spirits who would be preparing for the arrival of the Lord were immersed in the spiritual fluids of the planet. They would become humble and immortal followers in his divine footsteps. Now, I would like to believe that all of us that are here in the center fall in this, immortal followers in his divine footsteps. Once we come across the essence of the teachings of Spiritism, or any teaching currently in the world that's being transmitted thanks to the Consoler, it's undeniable. Once it reaches the realm of understanding, it's hard to go back. It's hard to abandon it. We're committed. We are involved. Our conscience has awakened to a level where we have to keep going forward, right? So, but we want to go forward, right? That's, I think, the beginning when we talked about how much do you think your soul has been evangelized up to this point? And I gave my opinion, which I think the spontaneous, free outpouring of those teachings, not something that's forced, not something that's, that is not within us. So for us to continue in this road, we want to, not because we have to, not because somebody is forcing us to do. Anything that's forced from the outside doesn't last. At some point, it dilutes itself, it loses its importance, right? I'm almost done, guys. Promise. It is for that reason that the mystical ascendance of the era of Augustus, the mystical ascendance, meaning all that spiritual invisible power of serenity, of joy, of tranquility, he's referring to that mystical ascendance of the era of Augustus, occurred amid the peace and the joy of the people. So the people were at peace, things were happening and working with stability and tranquility. This occurred amid the peace and the joy of the people, who instinctively felt that they were on the verge of a heavenly transformation. It's really when we reach the age of 18 and we're now officially adults, right? We get a greater sense of freedom, a greater sense of joy, of new opportunities, and more responsibility too, right? The sublime emissary was going to arrive on earth. His lesson of truth and light would spread throughout the world as, look at how beautifully he writes, his lesson of truth and light would spread throughout the world as showers of magnificent and comforting blessings. From that moment, humanity was living the century of the good news. It was the engagement party. Like a bride, the bridal party was the engagement party that Jesus referred to in his undying teaching. Now, I believe it could be a wedding feast or an engagement party. This is something that I need to research, and maybe in the next 29 months we'll see precisely which teaching Humberto is referring to. But suffice it to say that the spiritual idea of this is of a marriage, of a wedding, of an alliance, or of a fusion, right? Of the bride that Jesus referred to in his undying teaching. After that feast of hearts, which served as an indelible guide to humanity's harmony, the gospel would remain the most lively and beautiful book of the world. It's quite beautiful to say, and even to this day, modern missionaries that have reincarnated recently, like Gandhi, would agree, and they would say that from the gospel, the Sermon of the Mountain, he said, if all the books of civilization were burned and only the Sermon of the Mountain survived, civilization would be able to continue without a problem. So that's from the gospel. That's material from the gospel. Let's see, we're almost done. One paragraph to go. After that feast of hearts, which served as an indelible guide to humanity's harmony, the gospel would remain the most lively and beautiful book of the world, constituting the permanent message of heaven among the beings who are in transit through the earth. So, through many reincarnations have we come across these heavenly messages, right? But in different ways of understanding. Maybe 500 years ago, we had a different relationship with the gospel when we were presented with it 500 years ago on this planet, somewhere in some country. Maybe 200 years ago when we reincarnated in our last life, we had a more refined, more intelligible understanding of the gospel because we were inheriting from previous generations all the knowledge, all the wisdom, and all the teachings that accumulate, and we become better discerners naturally, right? That's why it's such an amazing gift, it's such an amazing privilege, and an amazing opportunity to be incarnated today in 2018, when for the first time ever in this planet, we have access to the entire world through Google and other search engines and other tools that can give us the knowledge and wisdom of the entire planet within seconds, so that there is no excuse to not wanting to advance in knowledge, right? The responsibility and that freedom is in our hands. The map of the blessed spiritual heights, the guide of the way, the manual of love, courage, and everlasting joy. Joy again, that joy of the gospel. Last paragraph. Take a deep breath. Congratulate yourselves for surviving this ordeal. For sleeping a little bit, not so much. Nobody snored. Yes. Okay. So in order to maintain such characteristics among humanity as the expression of his wise will, in order to maintain such characteristics among humanity as the expression of his wise will, Jesus recommended to his apostles that they initiate his glorious testimony with the hymns and sweet sense of nature under the wonderful light of a star that would guide kings and shepherds to the rustic manger here, where the first notes of his melody of love were chanted. This is the beginning of the gospel. It begins in this joyful evening when the most elevated spirit that ever came to planet Earth was born in a simple manger surrounded by animals appeased. And in one of Humberto de Campos' other accounts, in another book, he is chatting very casually with rabbis in the spirit world. And they were talking about the sacrifices of animals for our diet. And they say, actually that night of the manger, when Mary and Joseph were going from lodge to lodge, from hostel to hostel, from house to house, to try to find some room for them to be born, according to this rabbi's account in Humberto de Campos, all the doors that Joseph knocked on, the men looked at him and Mary, but they looked at Mary with very lustful eyes. Like, wow. Is she a descendant of a slave? Is there a monetary amount attached to having her? Can I have her? He was insulted by that many times. So the animals inside those humans didn't provide a safe enough environment for the Christ to be born. And he has to be born among the peace, docility, simplicity, and beauty of these animals. And so the rabbi concludes that teaching by saying, if that's the case, if we owe to the animals the coming of Christ to the earth, shouldn't we think of refraining from sacrificing animals, at least on the day of Christmas? And he leaves that open. We're not here making any recommendations on nutrition, because as Christ said, it is more important what comes out of man's mouth than what goes in. So if we can evangelize our speech, is much more preferable and urgent than vegetarianize our intake. So this is just for us to keep in mind. But that's a very beautiful account of the many that Humberto de Campos tells as a journalist. So the gospel begins right here, in this night. And they should also finish it with a luminous vision of the future of humanity in possession of the blessings of redemption. It is for this reason that the gospel of Jesus, which is the book of love and joy, begins with the description of that glorious Christmas night, and it ends with the profound vision of the liberated Jerusalem, as described by John the Evangelist in his divine prophecies of the apocalypse. So we in the Spiritist circles haven't really got into studying in detail the book of the Apocalypse. Apocalypse literally means, just like evangelium means good news, apocalypse literally means revelations. So it was a moment when John sought refuge in an island of Patmos to escape from the persecution that the Roman Empire was going after a lot of the Christians. And in his old age there, he has these out-of-body experiences, and he's taken by the spirits, by Christ, to show him all of the things that would happen in humanity. And he's able to glimpse these visions that are very beautiful and sometimes a bit too symbolic for us to understand. And he sees this vision of the glorified Jerusalem, dressed in pearls and gems and golds. Now, Jerusalem is the earth, is the new earth. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to go through it, but I invite you later, or now, if you want to take a photo, to savor the consoling and uplifting content of the last book of the Apocalypse, which is chapter 21, and I put the end here of chapter 22. We don't have time, but yeah. I'll leave it up for you guys to read at your own time here. For the video, do we read or we put the slides, right? Okay. Word inherit is important, a possession. Okay. We will recommend, go online, take a look at the last two books, chapter 21 of the Apocalypse and 22, because it's the outcome, the end. I'll take a photo of the next slide. Go ahead. Oh, look at the technology. Thank you, Steve Jobs and all those in technology who have given us the iPhone. We can now, or the Android phone. This lecture is not being sponsored by any one of those corporations, by the way. But we do welcome their donations. They're tax deductible. Just conclude here. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. And no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. There's a reference about the sun, just like we saw the poem that Augustus heard about the sun. He talks about the Lamb of God being the sun. You see, does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light. And the Lamb is its lamp. The nations will walk by its light, and kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. And no day will its gates ever be shut, no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. Nothing impure will ever enter it, nor will anyone who does what is shameful or deceitful, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. And the Lamb, being Christ, has a bride in this analogy. And the bride is the earth, is all of us who are his followers, his disciples, who have evangelized ourselves and can enter into a marriage, into an alliance, into a wedding with the will of Christ, with the realm of Christ. The Spirit and the bride say, "Come," and let the one who hears say, "Come." Let the one who is thirsty come, and let the one who wishes to take the free gift of the water of life. It's so beautiful. Free gift of the water of life. It's very profound. Any questions about this? So he mentions the word inheritance. I just want to conclude with this. From the Living Spring that we read actually this Tuesday, when the title of the lesson is The Father's Heir. And he says, and that it is up to us, the followers of the Master, as Sonia said, followers, to act as sincere workers. That's what I meant about spontaneous. Free, simple, spontaneous, not forced. Sincere workers who have been called to serve and cooperate with the long and patient, but permanent and eternal endeavor of the one whom the Father made heir of all things, and through whom he made the world. We are heirs ourselves, but we haven't yet gotten in possession of all of these teachings. They haven't become part of our heart and our spirits, and that's the struggle that's long and patient. that we will, in each and every lifetime, with goodwill, be able to implement. Did you remember seeing that beautiful picture of the manger? It's in that picture that the spiritual atmosphere of the world in the gospel is saying, glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to men and women of goodwill. This almost serves like a beautiful mantra for us. It's one of the most enlightening, uplifting passages. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to men and women. The only condition is what? Of goodwill. So as long as we are harboring that goodwill in us, heaven will provide the rest. The spirit world, God, our guardian angel, whatever you want to call it, we will be there and it will never abandon us. So I just want to thank you for your attention, for your time, for experiencing the glimpse of the good news. We really haven't gotten into the good news yet. This was just the introduction. The real deepening, the real dive into the ocean of the joy of the gospel begins in chapter 2. So we would invite you to watch our friend Marcelo, who's going to give the second chapter, right, in October. So I want to invite you all to have a reflective moment of prayer and meditation. That's going to be our healing passes of the night. And as we do it, let's all meditate on how these teachings can make our hearts a little more evangelized than when we came in here.